Hello and welcome to the fourth lecture as part of the Open University's MOOC on genocide. In today's lecture, we will review together the various case studies of genocide we will deal with during this course in the coming weeks. We talked a bit about the Holocaust in our first lectures. I mentioned that the Holocaust of European and non-European Jewry would influence our discussions here throughout this course. However, we will focus on a few specific cases of genocide, occasionally comparing them with the Holocaust. Sometimes I'll use examples from concepts regarding the memory of the Holocaust engraved deep in our subconscious here in Israel. But we will focus on several cases, which I will now briefly review with your permission. The first case of genocide we will discuss is the one that occurred in Rwanda between April and June of 1994. We just marked 20 years last year since this horrific genocide, known as the fastest genocide in history. Within 3 months, about 900,000 people were massacred, mainly by cold weapons like machetes and knives. We will elaborate on this genocide during our second week of classes in the Genocide MOOC. I just want to point out some general guidelines related to this genocide, and I'll use some terms I mentioned in the previous lecture as we discuss the preconditions for genocide. Looking back at the Rwandan genocide of 1994, if we try to see whether the regime indeed planned it in advance and intended to exterminate the helpless minority group called Tutsi, the answer is unequivocally yes. In fact, the genocide in Rwanda is the only case of genocide, other than that of the European and non-European Jewry, which is entirely known and considered genocide in all respects by the international community without a shred of doubt. During our second week of classes, we will break down the said conditions, the evidence for the act, or smoking guns, if you will, which will help us show this was indeed a planned act of genocide for all intents and purposes. One notable issue related to the Rwandan genocide is the fact that if we look for the main reason for this genocide, we will eventually come to discuss European racism, oddly enough. How is it that the African Hutu majority group in Rwanda attacked and murdered the African Tutsi minority group using racial theories originating from Europe? This intriguing question will be answered extensively over the next week when we will discuss the genocide in Rwanda. The next case study in our MOOC after we finish discussing the Rwandan genocide is the Armenian Genocide of 1915. Here in Israel, we occasionally hear about the Armenian Genocide. In recent years, we may have become more aware of it because of the disputes and tensions in Israel's ties with Turkey and the attempts by some to threaten the Turks that here in our country, in Israel, we recognize the Armenian Genocide, so watch out. The truth is that over 20 countries in the civilized world have already recognized the genocide so far. Israel has not done that yet. By the way, the United States didn't do it either, at least not as a federal body, though some states in the United States have already recognized the Armenian Genocide. The Armenian Genocide, which according to the empirical data, resulted in the deaths of 600 to 800,000 Armenians, mostly between April and November of 1915, and lasted a few more years with lower numbers, is one of the most prominent cases in terms of genocide studies. It is also one of the clearest examples of a case of double narrative. The narrative of the Turks, or modern Turkey, who to this day refuses to acknowledge its responsibility in part or in whole, at least as the successor of the Ottoman Empire, versus the narrative of the Armenians and the states supporting their narrative who considered these events genocide in all respects. What exactly happened there? How did it happen? Why do we suddenly see that from one fine day, April the 24th, 1915, and thereafter, the blood of an entire community that lived in its historic homeland for 3,000 years, albeit under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, became fair game, many of them murdered and those surviving deported or becoming refugees outside their historic homeland? We will discuss all this in the third week of our MOOC. The following cases we will discuss will be the murder of the Roma or the Gypsies during the Second World War. As you obviously know, Germany not only led the project of exterminating European and non-European Jewry, they also eliminated other groups of people. Perhaps the most prominent group was the Gypsies, the Roma, as they are called. We will examine this issue in an orderly fashion. Here too, we will find that the main reason for the extermination of Gypsies was a racial one, in that Nazi Germany attempted to improve the population, not just in Germany, but in the whole of Europe. These stories are shocking as much as they are fascinating, and we will deal with this matter properly later on in this MOOC. We finished this discussion as part of the MOOC by reviewing two very interesting yet different cases of very large population groups that were either intentionally destroyed or simply killed for reasons not necessarily deliberate and genocidal to begin with. These two cases are related to the wide-scale mortality of the Native American population in the areas Spain occupied in the Americas during the 60th century. We researchers believe nearly 50 million people died within a few decades, most of them infected by diseases brought unwittingly by the Spanish conquerors from Europe to America. And of course, the local Native American population didn't have an immune system that could help them recover after these plagues. And this led to disaster on an unimaginable scale with tens of millions of victims. This, along the intentional acts of genocide by the great Spanish conquistadors, led by the famous Cortés and Pizarro, who deliberately exterminated hundreds of thousands of Native Americans, without a doubt. We will elaborate on this towards the end of our short course. The last case we will discuss is the disappearance of the Native American population in North America from the face of the earth, particularly during the 19th century. Modern research estimates that in 1776, when the United States was founded, 6 to 10 million Indians lived in the area it eventually spread to during the 19th century. We cannot know exactly how many. In 1890, a population census was done among all Native Americans already organized in reservations throughout the United States, and the total number reached 250,000 people, a quarter of a million. We will try to explore together the question, or answer the question, where did nearly 10 million Native Americans disappear? We'll pretty much end our 5-week MOOC with this issue, focusing on these issues in the coming weeks. I hope we will all find this interesting. The topics we will discuss are not simple. They often require some kind of mental and psychological readiness. They are not easy to digest, and they sometimes may leave one somewhat morbid. I can assure you that at least the teaching staff, Mr. Ohad Rosenberg and myself, will work together with you during the lectures and on the course website and try to make the discussion on these materials less morbid and more interesting in terms of history, psychology, anything we can touch neatly. That's it for today. Goodbye and see you later.